Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Fay. I'm going to be reading first from Pathological, and that it was my debut memoir, The True Story of 6 Misdiagnoses. All of you need to know right now for this excerpt is essentially how the book is constructed. So I wanted to create a different kind of memoir, a journalistic memoir that offered as much information about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, as possible, because I spent 25 years in the mental health system with serious mental illness. And during that time, I didn't even know what the DSM was. So there I was getting one diagnosis after another, 6 in total, and had never even heard of this book where all of our diagnoses come from. And there's something kind of wrong with that, I think. But what happened to me was I ended up seeing a new psychiatrist when I was in my 40s, and he looked at me and said, "I don't know what you have." And my whole world changed because it was the first time someone said, "I don't know." And I took it upon myself to investigate and find out everything I could about psychiatric diagnoses. And what came of it is Pathological. So as I tell my story of mental illness, I also tell the story of the DSM, how it came into being, how it came to be embraced by the medical community, how it came to be part of the public conversation around mental health, in fact, the dominant part. Why do we speak in terms of diagnoses? And then there's a third strand of the book, which has to do with punctuation. So forgive me, but I am very much obsessed as a writer, I think, in terms of words and punctuation. But punctuation also felt like an apt metaphor in that punctuation is very much how we try to order and communicate. And in some ways, in my more forgiving moments, not that I'm not forgiving of psychiatry, I'm not anti-psychiatry by any means, but that I realize the DSM in many ways is just an attempt to order and organize and communicate. So that's how that is. So, at this point in the book, I am unable to live independently. I'm in my 40s. I've been diagnosed with bipolar 1 after 5 previous diagnoses, and my psychiatrist is named Dr. M. My sessions with Dr. M revolved around my illness. His questions reframed events and interactions in terms of my bipolar. My past became reordered, memories played at a slower or faster speed. The motivations behind this or that decision were different now that I saw them through the lens of bipolarity. His presence, just his presence, promised I'd never be suicidal again. The time between our sessions was interminable. Always there loomed the threat of another episode, depressive or manic, worse than the one before. Only he had the answer. With him, I managed my new life as someone with bipolar. Managed was a word I heard and read a lot. Manage meaning handle. Manage meaning cope. I learned more about bipolar disorder than any layperson should know. I subscribed to BP Hope, a magazine for people with bipolar. The My Story column featured people who revealed their long battles with bipolar disorder, a country musician, an ex-model, a lawyer. I turned page after page of drug ads for Latuda and Abilify and other antipsychotics to the Ask the Doctor column, which covered the many medications I had to choose from. My mother asked to read it because she wanted to learn how to better support me. I let her. When she finished and handed me the magazine, her face clouded with concern. "Are you sure you want to read that?" I said, "Of course," and asked why. "It's just so dark." The internet offered so much information, so much contradictory information about the natural remedies I could add. Folic acid and vitamin B12 were crucial to sound mental health. No, magnesium was. A high-fat, low-carb diet caused depression. No, a low-fat, high-carb diet did. Green and black teas were high in the amino acid L-theanine, which relieved stress and anxiety, but caffeine triggered manic episodes. The Mediterranean diet was the key to relieving depression, but only in smokers. Blogs on the Harvard Health website reported that there was, quote, overwhelming evidence for a connection between food and mental health, though others insisted further studies were urgently required to elucidate whether a true causal association exists. I scrolled down the Medical News Today website past an ad for Vraylar, an antipsychotic as yet unknown to me, to be told once again that bipolar might be caused by a chemical imbalance that may or may not be helped by fish oil and vitamin C. Website after website confirmed that my prognosis was grave. With the diagnosis, my life expectancy had shortened by 9 to 20 years. The illness would worsen over time, each manic or depressive occurrence increasing that likelihood. With each depressive episode, my risk of having dementia rose. There was a very good chance I'd never have a long-term relationship or hold a regular job. I'd relapse. I'd end my own life. The inevitable was coming: early death, more frequent episodes, relapses, suicide. I admitted to myself that I was, in fact, living, not staying, with my mother. I registered with a disability at one of the universities where I worked. My diet was impeccable, my sleep regular when I wasn't in an episode, and my schedule precise. I rarely went out at night or during the day except to teach, walk, and run. I wrote my novel, I read, I watched Netflix, I prepared classes, I taught. I lost count of the number of times Dr. M told me how ill I was. The premise of our work together is that I was very, very sick. Occasionally, he agreed with person-first consideration that I was someone with a mental illness, not mentally ill. I was, as the cliche goes, more than my illness. It's not as if I could have questioned my diagnosis. Not admitting I was bipolar indicated a lack of insight and anosognosia, which meant I was in denial, which meant I was sicker than I thought. 4 months later, Dr. M said it was time to stop the SSRI. Really? I asked. He said that antidepressants could induce mania in bipolar patients, and long-term use could spur more episodes and potentially cause something called rapid cycling, a pattern of moving more quickly between periods of depression and mania. I thought of how I'd stood at my kitchen counter 5 years earlier with the SSRI, that orange oblong pill between my fingers, how nimbly I'd swallowed it. Within minutes, seconds, my mind had stilled and I'd entered a sea of calm, innocuous, palatable, a simple adjustment. It's helped though, I said. He shook his head. It won't for long. The literature, a term he used often to assert his authority, agreed he was right. Later, I'd learned that the literature didn't fully support his conclusion. Until 2002, antidepressants were used as the first line of treatment in bipolar disorder. And although some of the older antidepressants seemed to trigger manic episodes, similar evidence with modern antidepressants like SSRIs was lacking. According to studies, the risk of my illness worsening as a result of the SSRI was 12%. The likelihood of improvement was 41%. If I'd known that becoming bipolar would mean going off my SSRI and that going off my SSRI would lead to 8 months of severe withdrawal symptoms, I might never have let that oblong orange pill slide down my throat. My other doctor didn't mention that if after 5 years I tried to go off it, it wouldn't be a simple adjustment, nothing like taking off a pair of glasses, as he'd said. In some ways, it wasn't my doctor's fault. Without Eli Lilly and 7 other key opinion leaders, as pharmaceutical companies call doctors whose research they fund, my doctor would have known to warn me that going off my SSRI, my supposed happy pill, which never made me smiley face happy, but did slow my racing thoughts, would lead to 8 months of anxiety and paranoia, akathisia and confusion, sweating and agitation, insomnia and nightmares, and crying spells and seeing things and people who weren't there. And brain shivers, which made me feel like a waterfall of needles was cascading down the back of my head. And brain shudders, which made my mind feel like it was trembling. And brain zaps, which made me feel like I was being electrocuted. 2 months into my withdrawal, 2 months of tapering, each subtraction of a milligram of my SSRI, another zap or shiver or bout of confusion, I sat beside my mother on her blue couch. Staring down at my feet, I traced the pattern of her oriental rug so as not to look at my shaking hands. She sat beside me, her brow furrowed again. I tried to explain what was happening with the withdrawal, but telling her about the brain shivers and brain zaps and seeing things that weren't there would have upset her too much. So I told her about the trembling and sweating and crying spells and rushes of panic. She said I should call Dr. M. Even I could hear the panic, even I could hear the panic in my voice as I left him a message. We waited. My mother rubbed my back the way she had when I was a child. In time to the arcs drawn by the movement of her fingers, I traced the curves on the design of her blue carpet under my feet. Dr. M called back at 10 minutes to the hour. He must have listened to my message right after his previous patient left. My brain feels foggy, I said, after I told him a short, sanitized version of what was happening. His voice was concerned, steady. As he spoke, reassuring, planning what to do next, I told myself I'd be fine. Everything would be fine. Trust is more of a transaction than an emotion. There are two parties, the trustor and the trustee. The transaction will take place in the future. By placing herself in the trustee's hands and at his whims, the trustor has no power. When the word came into English in the Middle Ages, it had more to do with religious faith than relying on someone with power and having that trust honored. But it wasn't long before it became tied up in the honesty of the person trusted. The psychologist Erik Erikson said trust is the first stage of psychosocial development, lasting from birth until around 18 months. If children learn they can trust their caregiver, they'll be able to form trusting relationships and secure attachments throughout their life. If they learn they can't, they're more likely to go through life with anxious attachment, insecurity, and fear. As adults, trust prevents us from getting stuck in analysis paralysis. It allows us to move forward and past the boundaries set by our rational minds. One could argue trust is delusional. It's privileging a delusion, the trustee's reliability and honesty, which may or may not be there, over reality, the inability to know for sure. 4 months into my withdrawal, I sat in my windowless office at the university where I taught, trying to prep for class. It was a Tuesday. It was April. The papers on my desk seemed far away, though they were right in front of me. My pen was pressed to one of them. I forgot what I was going to write. Something about the text we were reading, something about an electric zap shot through my brain. I closed my eyes and leaned forward, resting my head in my hands. It was startling, the power of the zap, how it reverberated. My instinct was to push through the zaps and shudders and shivers. As I reached for my notes for class, my hand shook. I stood unsteady, more than unsteady, like I didn't have legs. They were disconnected, as if they didn't belong to my body or to me. I left my office, having to return twice when I realized that I'd forgotten my water bottle and my copy of the text. With my bag slumped over my shoulder, I made my way through the sea of students in the hallway. It was a sea, my body a buoy bobbing among them. Midway down the hall, I strengthened. Being in motion helped. My legs woke, except I wasn't convinced I was real. The bag on my shoulder might have been someone else's shoulder. Me, but not me. My shoulder, but not my shoulder. The students who'd arrived early sat in their now familiar seats. Most stared down at their cell phones. A few tapped their screens. Others scrolled and scrolled. At the front of the room, I stood behind the podium and logged onto the computer. On screen, the homepage of the course website quivered, as if there were about to be an outage. I looked away. Two students whooshed in the door, talking animatedly. Their voices were loud and tinny. They sat in the back row, still talking. One said something about a parking violation or an accident. Their voices faded in and out. I wrote the date on the whiteboard. The glare of the fluorescent lights was too bright. I stopped writing and looked down at the speckled brown carpeting. The thought of canceling class didn't cross my mind. It was something I didn't do, my professional standard. I took attendance and stood at the front of the room, not having finished what I was writing on the board. Half the date was up there, written in black marker, alone with nothing after it, as if the time we spent in class would never end and existed in a void. My legs became shaky again. I leaned on the podium to steady myself. We delved into a discussion about, ironically, a piece of long-form journalism by Gabriel Mack, née Mac McClellan, about the failure of the mental health system. My students liked talking about mental health, which they referred to as mental illness. Given how many of them had come to my office hours to share that they suffered from ADHD or anxiety or depression or were bipolar, I assumed that was why. They were a pathologized generation, used to being told that distraction meant ADHD, sadness meant depression, and worry meant an anxiety disorder. Few were registered with the Center for Students with Disabilities. There could have been a million reasons for this, stigma being the big one, but it sometimes made me skeptical. They were so used to seeing mental illness portrayed dramatically and hyperbolically in YA novels and on TV shows and movies. Why wouldn't they think everyone had it? Why wouldn't their adolescent minds tap into it as an explanation? But a part of me wanted to say, of course you have anxiety. You're in college. You're given quizzes and forced to take tests and are graded. That's anxiety inducing. Other times, I believed every one of them had a mental illness. Did they already refer to their ADHD brains? Had they already been put on SSRIs to manage their anxiety or depression? How many of them had been told it would be a simple adjustment, just like wearing glasses? I asked about the author's use of form in the piece we were discussing, how it moved in and out of personal experience and facts about the mental health system. One student, one of the boisterous ones in the back, informed us that that part was, quote, boring. I asked more questions. Some of the students picked up the thread of the discussion and sewed it among themselves. When that trailed off, I asked another question. One of the students, always attentive, started to answer. In my vision, she started to blur, or rather cloud over. It was as if I'd stood too quickly and the room was fading, except I was still leaning on the desk. I somehow got through the 90-minute class. Afterward, without stopping at my office, I went outside. It was a bright, early spring afternoon, unseasonably warm, enough not to wear a coat. I was shaking. I called Dr. M. He didn't answer. I left a message and paced. When he returned my call, I had already decided to take myself to the emergency room. Something was very wrong, I told him. He reminded me that I was coming off the SSRI. I told him about the worsening brain zaps and not being able to hear what my students were saying and the cloudiness. He reminded me that that could happen when discontinuing an SSRI. We hung up. I wobbled and leaned on a small city tree to steady myself. Dragging my fingers along its rough bark, I told myself I'd be off the SSRI soon. Then I remembered Dr. M had said the last milligrams were the worst.